The athlete transition study has been a commitment of mine for about 7 years now. There's a couple of published studies. I'm going to talk a little bit about myself, just so kind of you know a little bit about me. But I really want to give the forefront to the athletes and what they have let us know about their experience and what we believe those findings mean and represent, and what we can learn from the athletes who took the time to participate in our study. So I'm a licensed psychologist. I'm also a certified mental performance coach. I'm the PI of the athlete transition study. I'm also the president and founder of a consortium of sports psychologists in the DC, Virginia, Maryland area, which is where I'm based. I'm in private practice. Probably about a third of what I do is with athletes. Um, the rest of my work is in transitions, relationship counseling, individual counseling. My relationship with sport did not take me through the collegiate pathway. I was a three-sport varsity athlete. Um, but I really didn't focus on a sport until I was more of a senior athlete. Now I compete in handball. So this is the court version, not the Olympic one where you throw a ball into a net. I'm a 40-time national masters champion, and I reached a career high rank of third on the senior tour in 2018. Pandemic took a toll on small sport tours. Um, but still compete at an open level as an athlete. And I just love working with athletes. It's just one of my reasons to continue to work. So the athlete transition study started in 2017. We have two publications. We're going to spend more of our time talking about well-being as it changes across time during that transition experience, which in our opinion, for many athletes starts about 6 months before they actually retire and then can extend for a very long time thereafter. So we looked at quite a few time points. That's where we're going to spend a majority of our time in the second half of this talk. I'm going to start by talking about the study itself and then a little bit about our first study, which looked at holistic health outcomes. So how many athletes struggle with what kind of health issues, and what are the most important dimensions for us to think about when we talk about transition. And these are the references to those studies. The research question that we wanted to address was very broad, starting with how many athletes struggle in their transition out of competition. So just a very basic question of what is the scope of the problem? To what extent do they struggle? At what points in time and for how long? Wanting to understand a little bit about who is at risk. So which athletes are struggling and which ones do we maybe have less reason to worry about? And then a question that I'm not going to address, but you'll see in the paper is, can we look at a transition model as helping us explain a little bit about how this process works? I'll just refer you to the paper for that information. If this was a 2-hour talk, we could get in there, but I'd probably put most of you to sleep during the last half. So we'll just count on keeping you alert for about 40 minutes and see if we can go from there. So the athlete transition study was a questionnaire. There were three of them, actually. One for football players only, that's American football. One for all sports outside of football, including soccer. And one of them was for non-elite athletes. We were hoping to have a comparison group. We ended up not being able to use that data. We didn't get enough participants who are comparable to our athlete group, unfortunately. The survey was on SurveyMonkey. It took an average of 23 minutes. Anyone over 18 who'd been retired for at least 3 months was eligible. And they had to have competed at an elite level, which for us, we defined as collegiate participation or its equivalent or more. They could play D1 or D3. They could even play for a non-NCAA program. Of course, there are sports that do not take the collegiate pathway. We have someone whose name is cat fencing. Not very many schools have fencing. Fewer of them have things like badminton or NASCAR racing or equestrian or archery. These are some the types of programs that have more or less opportunity, but a lot of people get private instruction, and some people skip the collegiate pathway entirely. Gymnastics might be a good example where historically the athletes compete in the Olympics before they'd even be eligible for college. And the study looked at 4 different domains: demographics and competitive variables. So, their personal and sport, their career. What are the factors of their transition? What is their health, both during the transition and afterwards, from a holistic, multi aspect? And then their support systems, which some of you might have heard me talking to you guys about at the very beginning. Did they use support systems? Who was there for them? Who wasn't? Really just wanting to understand how they got through the transition experience. And so we looked at that as well. We ended up with about 540 viable participant surveys. When you got rid of duplicates and people who dropped out part way and that kind of stuff. The average age of our folks was 34, with the standard deviation of almost 11 years. They'd been retired an average of 10 years. You'll notice that our sample was almost 70% female, and 80% Caucasian, and almost 90% their nationality was identified as having competed in the United States. So this is a largely American, white, female population. For the education, you'll see that 40% of them had a graduate degree, which is a very highly educated group. And 87% of them had at least a bachelor's degree. So we have, again, like a very educated group as well. So as we think about any results from a study, we always want to understand who the heck we're talking about here. And in this case, we're talking about a white educated female population. So just having that in mind. The good news is we have a very sizable sample relative to most studies in this group. So that helps. I did want to answer some of the question about what we know already about why this is an important study to conduct. Part of it is we don't have a lot of answers to these questions, and the scope of the issue is sizable. We have to understand also, when we're doing data like this, every athlete's journey is different. And so when you're making generalizations, as someone who's worked both individually and with groups of athletes, these journeys are really different person to person. And so you really want to be mindful about not over-categorizing people or thinking that you could understand someone fully from the general data. And then it's also important to know that this is an inevitable part of the athlete life cycle. There is no such thing as an athlete who fails to retire from sport. And it's one of the earliest retirements of any career. The only thing you could potentially compare it to would be a uniformed military veteran will have retired at an early age. After that, there's just really no third place. And there's a lot of similarities that people find between active duty military and athletes, which we don't have time to get into, but they're a group that I think relate to each other very well. In 2022, there were 522 identified NCAA collegiate athletes in the US, and they have 5 years of eligibility. So what this means, if you kind of extrapolate from it, is that there's more than 100,000 athletes in the US that are retiring or transitioning out of competition every year. That's a lot of people. And if we think about their risk factors, studies have shown that anywhere from 16 to 20% of them will have a diagnosable mental health concern during their transition, which far exceeds the national average. And so this is a pretty high risk group. especially as we'll get further into this, looking at the fact that many have subclinical distress. You may not be able to give them a diagnosis, but I think all of us know what it's like to go through a really stressful period of time where maybe we're not going to be diagnosed as depressed or with an anxiety disorder, but we're certainly not feeling great. And those are also at-risk individuals. Um, and I think what we need to look at is trying to dispel a myth that many fans believe, which is that professional athletes all retire wealthy and happy and beautiful and handsome, having experienced a really great career where they'll revel in the fame and money that they earned. That is almost never the case. In some sports, I would argue it's probably never the case. And in many sports, it's really only the select few. The average career length for someone in the NFL is 3.3 years. In the NBA and NHL, it's 4.5 years. And in baseball, Major League, it's 5.6 years. If you look at labor statistics regarding income, there were 25,000 professional athletes in 2023. So this encapsulates the major sport categories. The median pay was $70,000 for these professional athletes. The lowest 10% earned 28,000, and the highest 10% earned on average 240,000. And in addition, this will come as no surprise to us, a professional athlete ranks at pretty much dead last for job security and job stability. You compare that to a psychologist. Of course, I'm going to compare it to myself, where the median income is 93,000. The lowest 10% earn 52,000. The highest 10% earn on average 152,000. And psychologists rank as one of the most stable and secure jobs that you can have, in addition to not having to worry about getting fired at a moment's notice. So, we're really looking at a very volatile group who don't have job stability and often are ejected from their sport without security in terms of their finance or what comes next. So what our first paper tried to focus on, I'm going to have to, as much as I love all of your pictures, I'm going to have to shrink you. There we go. Our first paper looked at two things. The first one was how many of our athletes struggled with their health during their period of transition, particularly the period of difficulty. So we asked the question, think about when you had the most difficulty coping with your time of transition after retiring from sport. For that period of time, how frequently did you experience the following? And we asked if it was never, rarely, sometimes, or often. And we had these 13 questions, which we kind of glommed together into one metric for our next question. But for this one, we just look at our frequencies. And what we see here is, in my opinion, more in line with what I experience in talking to athletes about their transition process. Specifically, if you merge the sometimes and often, 56% experienced pain, 50% little interest, 56% depression and hopelessness, 12% considered suicide, 53% experienced anxiety and feeling on edge, and 50% said they had trouble controlling their worrying or being unable to stop their worrying. And 57% said they felt lonely or socially disconnected. So to me, these findings really support the fact that, yes, maybe 16 or 20%, 1 out of 5, have a diagnosable consideration. But you have another about 30% that are really in quite a bit of distress, but may not quite reach that level where they would have a diagnosis. Uh-oh. For our next question, what we wanted to look at were the variables of transition that research has most frequently said are sources of concern. So when you compare athletes who have a difficult transition, what are the things that most come to mind as being the reasons why they may or may not struggle? And these were the questions that we asked. These kinds of key variables. Had they been making plans before their retirement? Did their retirement come suddenly? Was it a surprise to them? Which is a variable under voluntary or involuntary retirement. Did their career last as long as they hoped that it would? Did they have control over the decision to retire? Did they feel satisfied with their career in sport? Like, can they reflect back on their career and feel like, you know what, I did what I really wanted to do. I feel good about what I did in sport. We also asked about athletic identity. I don't have that question up here. But to what extent did sport define them as an individual in terms of what their interests were and how they thought about themselves? And we also asked about team atmosphere. The question we asked is, the last team I played for had a healthy or positive team atmosphere. So one thing that often comes up is athletes who have a negative team environment or negative sport environment when they retire have a more difficult time. So what we did was we threw all of these things together into a multivariable linear regression model. There's not going to be a test after this talk, so you do not need to remember or even know what that is. Thankfully, I have a statistics specialist who works with us to make sure that we're doing all of our stats properly. So what this ends up doing is you take all of your variables that you think are important, and you toss them all together into this regression model. The model does what's called a highest zero order correlation. So it finds the variable that most explains your outcome, which for us was the answer to these questions. When we put all these questions together, who was struggling the most? Who had the most difficulty with all of these items put together? And then we asked these 8 questions, and we're like, all right, Mr. Statistics, tell us what the most important are. And what our findings came out with is that a sudden or surprise retirement was by far the most important factor. This is, again, an aspect of involuntary retirement. It explained 10.5% of the total variance. So when we're looking at why do these athletes struggle so much, 10% of it was explained by surprise. Now, we explained a total of 23.2%, which for many people will look at that and be like, okay, like that is an F minus minus. That explains almost nothing. When you look at social variables, they're so complicated and so multi-causal, and there's also a lot of noise that's involved with them. Even explaining 23% of the variance is not bad. It's very unusual to be able to explain more than 0.4 for a statistic of this kind, especially when you're dealing with a complex outcome, which this is. So I just sort of want to put that in context. Our next strongest variable was career satisfaction. To what extent did they feel like their career, they were satisfied with it? And then identity, again, this athletic identity versus having a more diverse identity, which I'll talk more about later, explained 4%. And then team atmosphere explained 1.6%, gender 1%. As a kind of rule of thumb, women tend to have, or at least describe, a more difficult transition than men. But some of that can be explained by a number of different things, which I don't necessarily want to get into now, but it's not unusual for gender to be a small influence in these factors. What I thought was the most interesting, and I don't think my slide, no, I don't have a slide that looks at this, is what fell out of the model. So when you have a variable that actually does not explain enough influence just standing on its own, it just drops out of the model. And what I found to be really fascinating about this study is that in addition to these 5 variables, we looked at length of career, control of the decision to retire, and making plans. 2 of those variables are some of the most commonly cited variables by researchers as having an influence on whether your retirement was a difficult one or an easier one. So for instance, I made the decision to retire. The decision was in my control. It's probably one of the most common refrains that you hear. But when you look at these other 5 factors, and I would make the argument, particularly things like surprise and satisfaction, the plans part just fell out. It did not explain any more influence. So plans didn't, and nor did control, which I think is fascinating. And it could just be a byproduct of this study, but I think it's worth speculating on the fact that surprise, and I think particular, probably explained enough where those 2 things really ended up not mattering enough to stay in our model. So I think that's a fascinating finding. So that was our first paper in a nutshell. Now I want to talk about our second paper, which looked at how subjective well-being changed across the transition experience. So we asked athletes to describe their well-being, and this is a picture of the question they got. So we asked about 6 months prior, day of retirement, 6 months after, 6 months to a year, 1 to 2 years, 2 to 3 years, after they no longer adjusted, and currently. We actually found that after adjustment and currently were almost the exact same to each other. And so we actually dropped the after adjustment because honestly, we just didn't have enough room on our graphs for one more data point. And you'll see from our graphs, they're already a little bit busy. But we just asked on a 10-point scale for people to rate their overall quality of life, which we defined as feelings of happiness and satisfaction, feelings of fulfillment with their daily life. And then we gave a couple of points. I was at rock bottom at 0, average at 5, and ideal, my life was close to perfect at 10. And that's what we call our outcome or dependent variable. And then we put this on 3 different questions, in part based on our first paper. So obviously, the first one we used was my retirement came suddenly, remembering that was our strongest variable. 33% of our sample agreed with this statement. We collapsed the agrees with the disagrees for simplicity. And 2/3 disagreed. They found that their retirement was predictable. It was not a surprise. It did not feel like it came suddenly. So what is a volunteer retirement? That in itself is a complicated question. And I want to talk about it because, in my opinion, it's the single most important consideration for us to have when we think about athletes who are at risk in their transition. A voluntary retirement is one that's made willingly. For lack of a better way of saying it, did you volunteer to retire? Did you come forward and say, I'm ready, I'm leaving? Or was it involuntary, like not of their choosing? The most common examples of an involuntary retirement are injuries and deselection. So an injury sort of forces a person out of play because they're no longer able to perform at the level that they did before, or they risk further either life-threatening or life-altering injury if they continue to play. This would be the case of Miami Dolphins quarterback very difficult decision to make with the concussions he had. Is it worth coming back, or is he going to choose to retire because the risk to permanent neurological damage might be too great? And this is sort of where the muddy area comes in, which I'll speak about later. And then deselection. I would make the argument that the simplest example is you don't make the roster. You tried out for the team and they didn't have a spot for you. And now where are you? The question of voluntariness includes things like control, surprise, and plans. So it kind of incorporates a number of the things that were in our first paper. Surprise also speaks to a lack of psychological preparedness. And to me, this is actually the single most important thing that I come back to when I think about what is so hard about an involuntary retirement is there's really no psychological preparedness. Synonyms include shock, astonishment, astoundment, flabbergasted, startled, dumbfounded, stunned, amazed, bewildered, and dismayed. A bombshell, a jolt out of the blue, a stunner, an eye-opener, or a thunderclap. So, these sort of, I think, illustrate the words that I've heard athletes use when they talk about what those first minutes, hours, or days can feel like. Synonyms for sudden include abrupt, unexpected or unforeseen, unanticipated, surprising, startling, improbable. I like the improbable one. I like it because elite athletes, many of them have a kind of like optimistic view. They kind of get, they have that profound belief. And so even though the signs might be there, they still might feel it's improbable and startling, unplanned and unintended. The next thing we used was identity. Mostly because this is probably the second or even first most commonly referred to variable when we think about the difficulty of transitioning. And we asked the question of being an athlete defined my identity, referring to who I am, how I view myself, where I get my feelings of self-worth. Now, the AIMS, or the Athlete Identity Measurement Scale, is the gold standard that generally gets used. We just asked this single question because the athlete transition study asked a lot of questions. And we really wanted to ask about a number of different points in time. In this case, we talked about when they were transitioning out of play, because that is the time that we're most curious about for this paper. And we basically divided them up into agree or disagree. What I found really a little bit startling is that 84% of our sample said that they agreed or somewhat or strongly agreed with the statement that being an athlete defined their identity. So we call that an athlete identity, as compared to a diverse identity, which would be someone who's like, no, I have other things about myself that really define who I am. Being an athlete is part of that picture, but there's more pieces of the pie than just being an athlete. And so I refer to that as having a diverse identity. Another term that sometimes gets referred to for athlete identity is athlete foreclosure, which is a term that sort of describes someone who's given up or abandoned or never pursued aspects of self that are not in their role as a competitive athlete. So those are, in the literature, they're sort of synonyms. And then the third thing we looked at was their reason for retirement. So we got a little bit more specific on this question. Mostly, again, wanting to understand who is at risk. Why a person chooses to retirement is a question that can be asked by a friend, clinician, parent, coach, or concerned stakeholder. And I think that the answer, if we understand a little bit about our risk groups, might help us know who may or may not need help. We made the decision to only include reasons for retirement where we had more than 25 athletes respond to them. But as you can see, we gave them a lot of options and people picked quite a few of them. We chose the primary reason for retirement. We also asked people, the question before this was check all that apply. So that's the question that you're seeing right now. And people picked anywhere from 1 to 6 or 7 different things that they felt played a role. So again, this speaks to every athlete has a different journey and how important it is to understand how multi-impactful and multi-influenced a person's retirement is. But what we ended up doing for the sake of simplicity is asking, all right, of the ones you chose, what is the primary reason? Like when you think about it all put together, what really was the main thing that led to it? And so we had a very highly collegiate level group. So 32% of our sample, their eligibility ran out / they retired. They graduated. Where is that one in my little list here? Eligibility ran out, graduated from college. 21%, it was either a single injury or accumulation of injuries. Their profiles were similar enough that we felt comfortable merging them together. There was no statistical difference in well-being between the accumulation of injuries or a single injury, which I thought was really interesting. To give me 10 seconds to say, I feel like with an accumulation of injuries, it would be less likely to be a surprise. It's the one single major incident that I had thought would result in a harder transition, because that's like going from peak performance to now you can't play at all. But interestingly enough, the accumulation of injuries had a very similar pathway. I thought that was interesting. 8% felt like it was the right time. And so that question was, it felt like the right time. I just knew that I was ready to retire. 6% pursue something else, which was wanted to pursue something else. And then 6% said motivation, which was lost my love of the game. So we have a really interesting collection of reasons for retirement here. And hoping. All right, so have to give you the statistics. So, bear with me here for a moment. We did what's called a linear mixed model. It first tests group main effects. So it compares our groups to each other to see if the groups themselves are different. So is the agree that it was a surprise different from the disagree that it was a surprise? And if the answer is yes, then we did a group by time main effect to see if there were any major effects across time. And then if there was, we looked at contrasts for each time period to see where those group by time effects came about. And you don't have to, again, memorize that or even understand it. But for the statistic geeks out there, that's what we did. And you can go into the paper to see and learn a little more about that. Because we had a highly educated and a highly female group, we put those into the statistic as what's called a covariate, which means we try to control for the impact of those variables in our outcome, to try not to allow those differences to be really the explanation for why there's differences. How does a statistic do that? That would take too long for me to explain, nor would I do a good job. So if you have that question, you're welcome to reach out to me and we can try to answer it together. And we also included time since retirement. There was a very wide range of people's distance from retirement. And there's also a very important finding, which is that of all of the things that impact retirement transition, how long it has been since your retirement has the most impact. But there's nothing you can do about that. So in a way, time heals all wounds, but it actually doesn't. And the reason for that is while statistically, you're going to see in our analyses, pretty much all of our athletes end up kind of at the same place eventually. But there is a small and important group where that is really not the case. This study did not look at that, but when people have either chronic pain or chronic health conditions that impact their quality of life in the future, they have prolonged impact that does affect their well-being long after they retire. And sometimes that pops up suddenly, and sometimes it pops up slowly. But for some, it's ever present. And for some, they're not even aware that it came from their experience in sports. So CTE would be a good example of something that's emerged as a budding awareness of problems that are somewhat lascivious to sport. But we incorporated that also as a covariate. And this shows that for identity, we had group main effects and time main effects, but interestingly enough, no time effects. And I'll show you what that means when we look at the graph. For surprise and also for reason for retirement, there were effects everywhere. And you'll be able to see that when we look at the graph. And so now I want to talk about our specific findings. I'll give a few minutes to each one, and then I'm going to open it up to questions. For athlete identity, what we find is that these lines are statistically parallel. I know that at the day of retirement, it looks like our athlete identity experienced a more significant decline than our diverse identity. And if we were allowed to only look at that, that would be true. But in looking at all of it together, these lines are actually statistically parallel. And what these findings articulate, at least in my opinion, like when we do our analysis, we're just trying to figure out what do these statistics mean, is that people with an athletic identity suffer well-being impact throughout the transition experience and even a little bit beforehand. When you get to current, which is this one all the way on the right, we see that eventually these things collapse until they're somewhat non-significant. But we're talking 2 to 3 years after retirement, there is still well-being impact over time. And the reason for this, we believe, is when you have a diverse identity, you have other things to fall back on, other interests, other way of defining yourself, other places where you get gratification. You kind of gotten a head start on what more you might do with your life. And there's sort of a place where you can start to look for what your future might be. Whereas if you define yourself entirely as an athlete, not only are you dealing with the shock of the loss, you're kind of starting from nothing. You're starting from ground zero. And you have to have like this empty identity that now has to be filled from the bottom up, which is profoundly difficult and really speaks to the question that a lot of people who transition out of sport ask themselves at the onset, which is, if I'm not an athlete, who am I? And I think the answer for them often in the very beginning is I'm nobody, and I don't even know how to start thinking about what I need to become. So that's the athlete identity part. And, I'm going to be able to go back to these in our discussion. So, I would look forward to people's thoughts or feedback. The next one we looked at was surprise. So here what we see is for the predictable group. So this is the group who said, my retirement was not a surprise. It was not sudden. What we see is a fairly flat curve. They had a little bit of a decline, which continued the day of retirement and continued to 6 months. This is not a statistically significant drop. It is a little bit of a drop just sort of visually, but then we see them improving and continuing to improve. And, kind of an artifact of what's called retrospective data. We did not ask these people to answer the questions at these 6 points in time. We ask them to reflect back on their career and to let us know in their memory, how did they feel at these points in time? So this might be a little bit of an artifact of retrospective data, especially when we look at, well, if it was a surprise, then why is there a difference at the 6 months prior? They should be the same. If you're only surprised the day that it happens, right? So that could be an artifact also. But I also want to talk about how not all surprises are unpredictable. I know that sounds like a contradiction, but I'll get to that in a second. For this group, we see a profound drop in well-being on the day of their retirement. So this really speaks to that shock that comes from leaving competitive play due to something that really hits you out of the blue that you feel you have no control over. And again, it speaks to what our prior study said. This is a very important factor for people to consider. And as we think about an involuntary retirement, in my humble opinion, we can divide that into two important, but I think somewhat distinct factors. One of them is predictability, and that's what we're talking about here. Could you have predicted this, or did it just pop out of the blue and come out of nowhere? And the other one is control. This is the ability to make the decision for oneself. It's having this feeling of agency, this feeling like no one made this happen other than myself. And people generally do not like having no control over their lives, particularly around something important. So I see those as two semi-distinct but important factors in a retirement. Was it predictable? Which again, like what I said before, talks about psychological preparedness. Like, were you thinking about this? Were you able to psychologically come to terms with it happening over time, even if it was something you didn't want? But you were able to sit with it and kind of marinate with it before it happened? Or did it come completely out of nowhere? And then the other one is control. Did you make the decision, or did something or someone else do this to you? I see a sudden retirement as kind of having factors of both, particularly around something like an injury. They're both out of your control and they're unpredictable. But interestingly, there's a lot of gray area in this. And I'll give you a couple of examples. When we think about a voluntary retirement, does an athlete with an abusive coach or in an abusive culture leave their sport voluntarily? I think you can make the argument that maybe they have control over the decision. They're the ones that say, you know what, I can't do this anymore. But how voluntary is it if it's an abusive environment? What about all of the athletes who are in sports where they're not having opportunities to play or compete, either because of something that they feel is unfair, or because they're not performing to a certain level, or like for an appropriate reason, like a coach has made the decision that, all right, we have 28 people on our soccer team, only 11 people can play, and I have 3 subs. Like, some people are not going to get field time. Or they might feel that it's really not an appropriate reason. Favoritism, racism, there's a lot of negative things that creep into sport environments that are out of an athlete's control that might impact their ability to get play. Or they may not have the performance they need to keep playing, and they might financially not be able to keep doing it. Golf and tennis are sports that are very expensive to compete in. So are they making the decision voluntarily to drop out because they're living off ramen noodles that their parents are buying for them for 3 years? So there's like muddy areas in the voluntariness. But I would make the argument that this predictability, the suddenness of it, that it comes out of the blue, and the shock of that is really the most important factor. All right, I'm going to ask you to entertain probably like 5 to 10 more minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions. This profoundly confusing graph is our reasons for retirement. And I'm going to discuss each one independently, but I sort of wanted you to see the whole thing first. These are our two graphs of pursue something else and felt like the right time, which are the two variables that most speak to someone saying, you know what, I'm kind of really ready. I want to do something else. I feel like my career ran its course. I've done what I wanted to do. They've probably thought about their retirement ahead of time. So they've had that psychological preparedness of having marinated on the idea for a while. And here we see a pretty flat curve out of retirement. So I would make the argument that who are the people that leave sport and really have next to no problems? This is that group. They wanted to pursue something else, so they were kind of excited about their next chapter and what they wanted to do. Their eyes were on the future, and they felt like it was the right time, meaning their reflection on their career, this sort of looking back on their career reflects, you know what? I met my goals. It's run its course. Now's the time. This is the injury group. So this is the group of people. It's 21% of our sample said that either a single injury accumulation did. So note that this is probably the quintessential involuntary retirement. And wow, what an incredible impact it has day of. And the reason for that is clear. This is a crisis without the ability to mentally prepare. It is a true sudden loss of identity. It's a moment where they face the loss of their community and the loss of their relationships in sport. They have a loss of structure, their source of esteem, their ambitions and goals. All of that sort of goes up in a puff of smoke. They also have a loss of health. So it's not just that they're leaving sport, they get the gift of an injury to leave with. For some, there's a loss of finance. I would make the argument that most of them will probably feel like their career failed to meet their expectations because suddenly they've gone from performing to not being able to. And it can create a prolonged transition process. The good news is that we see they start to show improvement right away. The bad news is look how long it takes. This is a very prolonged at-risk group. And I would say if there's any one group that truly deserves our attention as being at risk, is this injury group. Then there's our motivation group. Oh, did I miss one? Yeah. Here's our eligibility group. Just very briefly, what I think is interesting about this group is one, it was large. This was 32% of our sample. But we see this decline and then another decline, which is unusual. We didn't really see that with any other group. We think the reason for this is that these athletes are transitioning out of several things at the same time. So not only are they leaving sport, they're also leaving school, either at the time of their retirement, depending on whether they're a spring or fall sport, or soon thereafter. So there's multiple transitions happening at once. That is another risk factor, is how many transitions are you doing at the same time? And then this is my last slide. This is our motivation group. So this is 6% of our sample who lost their love of the game. What I think is really fascinating about this group, and also a little bit terrifying, is look how bad their well-being is 6 months before they retire. So this is a group that is miserable while they are still on the roster competing and at play. And they're, in my opinion, probably experiencing burnout and just struggling in order to keep themselves engaged. I have no idea how long a person can really last in that state of mind. And so this is a profound at-risk group before they even leave sport. And they're the only group that actually experiences a rise in their well-being. They actually feel better the day they leave sport. So for them, it's a relief. And we do hear this from people, even ones who don't say motivation is their reason for leaving the game. It is a lot of stress living in the competitive environment of elite level sport. Um, to have to continue to compete at that level is a privilege, but it's also a emotional toll and a burden. And for many people, not having to face that every day is a relief. One of the, I think, fun things about Roger Federer's, he did a recent Netflix documentary of the days that led up to his announcing his retirement. And the look of joy on his face when he did his last training exercise and no longer had to work out in the gym like he did before, being able to just put down the barbells um, is just a relief for, I think, many athletes. The problem with our motivation group is we see the impact of the burden of that burnout and the subsequent trying to recover from it. Even though they kind of feel better and better, it takes a really long time. They don't catch up to the rest of our retirees until current, which again, on average was 10 years. They're still experiencing this reduced well-being 2 to 3 years later. That's a long time to be struggling. Um, and so I think of them as another real serious at-risk group. And that is the last slide, which I know took a little longer than I had said that it would. And I apologize for that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop the share. And I can bring all of your beautiful faces up for those of you who have your screen on. And yeah, so I'd like to ask, Miriam, if there were questions that came through, and I'd like to open it up to anyone to be able to either share on the chat, or if, Miriam, you don't mind, you can call on the people who asked the questions if you feel like you'd like to do that. And I can bring up some of the slides again, and I can share them with anyone who's interested in them. They're not proprietary, they're published. And I can also share the articles themselves for anyone who wants to actually read the article itself.
Thanks, Dan. That was actually going to be one of the questions that I was going to ask you, but we'll make sure to share with everybody after this call, so that you guys can have access to the papers and read them more in detail. Thanks for really going through everything and showing the detail. I know the first time that you and I discussed those findings, I think I had said, wow, it reflects quite well what we have seen working with athletes. So, but it's nice to be able to have the study that shows that and the numbers behind it. Some of the questions that people ask were, are there other factors or questions you now wish you would have asked in the survey?
We asked so many questions. I don't know if anybody here, actually took the questionnaire. Yeah, so and thank you guys so much for doing so. Hopefully it didn't take you too much longer than the 23 minutes, but I know you guys are thoughtful people, so it probably did. In hindsight, I think what I might have wanted to do is ask fewer questions, but ask them in greater detail. But that's not what we did. We might try to follow up with some of our more important questions in a future study, but we'll have to see how that goes. I think this is such a complicated question that doing interview style questions is sometimes a great way to gather data, but you can't get as many people that way. But talking to the athletes is where I get the most pleasure. So, that's probably what I would do next time.
Yeah. And so has the study changed the way you work with athletes?
Uh, it has definitely made me far more concerned about certain athletes. Um, when it's very unusual for me to talk to an athlete about their transition before it happens. I'm more likely to talk to a program. And what I've found is that I've added some of this data to those conversations. Particularly relevant to me are these graphs about the reason for retirement. The visual, I think, really helps athletes to think a little bit more about the readiness, the having an eye on the future, to thinking about other things they might want to pursue. And I think it also brings into focus something that a lot of athletes should think about but don't, which is I don't think there's an athlete out there who's competed for more than a year or two who hasn't witnessed one of their friends leaving sport for a sudden or surprising reason, an injury, they don't make the squad. So they know intellectually this happens, but I feel like most athletes don't feel it's going to happen to them. And so I found that in talking about this, it kind of brings home that like 30% of our sample, this was why they left sport. So this is a very prominent reason. And I don't want people to walk around in terror they're going to get hurt. But I do want them to be aware of the fact that people get injured in sport all of the time. It's worth thinking about, well, I mean, let's just say that I do need to leave sports suddenly. I wonder what types of things I would need to do with my time. And do I get the resources and some of the coping strategies and just know who I would lean on and what I would do if that were to happen? It would be important maybe just to have those things in place. Um, a lot of us buy insurance not because we want to either die or get in a major car crash, but we have that just in case. And I feel like the just in case is an important message.
I love that you're saying this because, part of uh, what needs to happen is really conversing about athletic retirement and having and raising awareness, but also changing that narrative about being from the coaching part, I think, of being 100% into the game, or you're not going to be performing, because that's a dangerous view if you have people that may be at risk when they are 100% head down in the game and not thinking about anything else.
Yeah, what
Um,
I actually find to be a valuable conversation with coaches is the fact that athletes actually perform better when they're able to have a diverse identity, particularly when it includes things like family, friends, spiritual investment, and really something to either divert their attention and mind so that they can refresh themselves and feel like they come back with renewed vigor because they've given themselves kind of a little bit of a break by having more than one platform to stand on. When a person is in a slump, which happens to every athlete at some point in career, one of the best ways of coping with that is diverting your attention to some other interest when you're not actually trying to keep those skills sharp in condition, because it helps you not um, feel this feeling of like hopeless dread. Um, you know, you have something else to put a little bit of attention to, and it can make you a little more patient. That's usually the conversation that I'll have with coaches is that athletes actually perform better when they have those other outlets. It's not a distraction, it's actually an enhancement.
yep. And it helps avoid those burnouts, or sometimes help with the burnout, and also lengthen an athlete's career, which is, we don't talk about this enough. Like taking breaks and doing other things will help lengthen your career.
Yeah,
Someone,
absolutely. Especially in sports that are just, in my opinion, obscenely long, like golf, tennis, baseball. I mean, these seasons are, I mean, they work more days than I do. It's insane. I don't know how a person can physically cope with that level of prolonged, not just the physical strain, the mental strain of having to be on that often.
Dan, someone, Kat asked, have you encountered anyone who retired but then re-entered sport again once or more than once?
Yeah, a lot of people do that. Um, some of them because an injury takes them out of their sport of initial choice, and then they're just those remarkable people that find that they can actually compete at a elite level in another sport. So Hayden Hurst, the football player, is one such person. Um, there was a 30 for 30, and God, I'm embarrassed, I don't remember her name, but she was someone who did track and field. I think it was either shot put or hammer throw, and she injured her back, and then she became an Olympic kayaker. Um, and so, I've witnessed sports do that. And then you hear of people who, like Tom Brady, would be probably the most obvious example, who leave sport, I think, because they're exhausted. And then I think they feel such a sense of relief from, you know what, I can control this decision. And I gave myself a little bit of a break. And maybe what I'll do is I'll come back completely voluntarily. I think Simone Biles might be the most recent example of someone who I think she left sport after the Olympics and she came back completely on her own terms. And that different mentality allowed her to put in just, I mean, not just a tremendous work ethic to be able to make the Olympic team, but to also approach it with a different mindset that was different than the one that she had before. And it rejuvenated her. So yeah, I now, as much as I'd love to say I worked with Simone Biles, I have not worked with someone of that caliber, of which I'll say there's probably only a handful of people like her in the world at any one time. Um, but I've worked with athletes who have returned to sport, either the same sport or a different sport, um, and a different mindset that they may get from having stepped away and truly voluntarily returned to their sport or a different one.
Yeah. Cohen asked if there are additional ways that communities like Athletes Soul can help athlete transition.
So can you kind of repeat that question again? Or, Colin, did you ask the question?
Um,
Um,
I
can
don't
you
know.
repeat it to me? I didn't quite catch the.
Are there any additional ways that communities like Athletes Soul can help with athlete transition?
Oh, like athlete transition? Um, yeah, I think that when we look at successful programs in athlete transition, there's a number of different dimensions that we're hoping a person can leverage. Obviously, some of them are up to the athlete and they would take place while they are still competing. My hope is that the future of Athlete Soul will allow for much stronger access to the athletes who are still engaged in competition, at a minimum, being able to offer workshops and then resources for the athlete to express interest, to just understand more about what is available, what should you be thinking about, and what is there for you when you leave sport, just so that you're not doing a Google search at 2 a.m. when you can't sleep the day after you're injured. So that's the one thing that I would hope for. And that would allow for people to be aware of diversifying their identity, the importance of following through with their education, doing some financial planning or gaining financial literacy while they are still competing, um, and thinking about a gradual transition or other ways that they can stay in sport. A lot of athletes, when they retire, find ways of staying in their sport, but not as an elite competitor. So, what are those opportunities? And how can you network, connect with sports and stakeholders, use your platform and your brand as a way, while you still have the microphone, as already being in sport to be able to set yourself up well after sport. And that's something that I think athletes don't necessarily appreciate or do enough with while they're still competing. Because I don't think they really necessarily recognize the value, or they have the same delusion that all of us have. This is going to last forever. Um, I don't need to worry about that now. This bulletproof aspect, which comes from the age group we're talking about, right? I mean, people retire in their early mid 20s, maybe late 20s. All of us are idiots at that age. None of us think that we're going to have bad knees or we're going to develop arthritis. Those thoughts aren't in our head. Um, so I would also I think, greater counseling related to when you don't have the structure of the sport environment. How do you find resources and what kind of supports are available and what do you need to know around maintaining a healthy diet, maintaining healthy exercise? Because elite level exercise is not practical or healthy for a typical citizen. So, how do you engage in healthy exercise? Um, how do you build a social support system now that you're not in the sport system? What is financial planning and financial literacy? What type of career options are available to me in and out of sport? And how do I find what those interests are so I can know what to pursue? All of those types of resources, I think, need to be at an athlete's fingertips at the time of their transition, and they need to know that they're available before they actually start the transition process so they know where to go. That was a lot. So sorry.
It is
I
not,
can,
I think we're all on the same page on this
Amazing.
one and
Yeah,
agree that
this is
this
so
needs to
great.
happen early and when the athletes are still competing. Um, Dan, thanks for your time. I'm conscious of everybody. We went over the time, and so I want to close it down, but is it okay for me to share with those who participated today? If they want to reach out, can we share your contact information?
yeah, and I'll say that unless you need to end this call, I kept myself available until 6. So you probably want to go, and you probably have other meetings, but I'm actually able to stay and field questions. But anyone who wants to talk to me directly, please share my direct information. I think Kelsey can attest to the fact, not to call you out by person, but I'm completely open to bending anyone's ear over these issues. And part of how I try to respect the time that the athletes put into participating in our study is sharing the information with as many people as possible. And I mean, let's be honest, I don't know that I want to go back and read my own research articles. So, how many people are actually reading those articles? I don't know that I can say. So, having these direct contacts to talk about it is probably one of the best ways to share and respect their time. So, I welcome those conversations.
And your sharing your email is okay?
Yeah, absolutely. Yep.
Right. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to share. We'll definitely share the papers as well with the rest of the group, and we'll put that in our private group as well so that people can watch the recording. But yeah, really appreciate that you took the time to go through the study in detail and present the findings. That was really interesting. Thanks.
Yeah, I know it was probably like overly, this was more like the 400 sprint than the 100 sprint. So, I think it was definitely a sprint, but maybe a little on the long end. So, thanks for sticking with me. And I just so appreciate Athletes Soul giving me the platform to be able to talk about this, and for the commitment you have to something that's near and dear to my heart. So thank you to Athletes Soul.